One family was about to lose a year's worth of hay money because one old baler refused to spit out a single bale. For 3 days, every expert in the county had crawled under it, over it, and around it. They checked pressures, chased sensors, called the factory hotline, and that machine just lay there in the dirt like cold iron. Out behind the Radley place, more than 260 acres of hay were already cut and drying under the early summer sun of 1982. The radio said rain was coming Thursday. If that hay got wet, half of what Tom Radley was counting on this year would wash away on the wind. It was a Monday morning in early June when the New Holland baler finally gave up in public. It sat dead in the gravel yard of Frank Miller's dealership, quiet as an old horse that had decided it was done pulling. 3 days now it had been there, and it still would not push a single bale out of the chamber. Frank Miller stood a few steps away with his hands shoved deep into his jeans pockets. He was 50, had been building this dealership for 17 years, and he knew exactly what that baler meant to the Radley family. In a year when interest rates were jumping off the newspaper like a bad joke, he also knew what it meant if it didn't run. Tom Radley had bought that baler new in 1973 for $32,000, almost all of it borrowed. It took him close to 10 hay seasons to get it paid off. He was not going to walk away from it, and he couldn't afford to wait. The hay was down, the cattle still needed to eat, and the bank didn't care whether the baler felt like working or not. 3 days earlier, when the New Holland had started acting up in the field, Frank had done what a good dealer does for a long-time customer. He'd sent Tom home with a newer red baler from his own yard just to keep you going. Tom had run it for a few windrows, then shut it down and brought it back. "It doesn't tie right for this hay," he'd said, shaking his head. He'd rather wait on the yellow baler he trusted than learn to love a brand new one he didn't. Since then, every day that old baler sat dead in Frank's yard meant one more day of dealership equipment sitting in someone else's field not making a dime. One more day of shop hours piling up on a job that wasn't moving, and one more day Tom stopped by to ask, "Any news?" And Frank had nothing new to say. The first man to go after the problem was Frank's shop foreman, Mike Olson, a mechanic whose hair was more gray than not and who'd been working on balers since the mid-60s. Mike had spent most of the weekend with that New Holland, doing everything his hands and memory knew to try. Sunday evening he'd stood next to Frank in the gravel and said quietly, "She's cycling. The plunger is compressing fine, but the conveyor won't push the bale out. Everything I know to check." By Monday morning, Frank had made the call he didn't like making. He asked the factory office in Lincoln to send a certified technician. The man who arrived around noon looked like he'd stepped out of a brochure. Young, confident, company polo, diagnostic case in hand. He clipped on gauges, hooked up his meter, tested every safety switch and stroke sensor. He worked for hours. Then he packed up, loaded his case into his truck, and left Frank with one handwritten note on the bench. Hydraulic system within operating range. Stroke and safety sensors within spec. Cause of bale discharge failure undetermined. That was the kind of note that stole a man's sleep. It meant, "We did everything the book told us to do. Whatever happens next is your problem." By the next Monday morning, the sky over Clay County was clear and bright, but nobody in Frank's yard felt like calling it a nice day. Frank looked at the baler and felt like he was staring at a loaded truck with a hole somewhere below the waterline that no one could find. He knew Tom was listening to the same forecast and doing the same math. How many bales? How many dollars? How much debt? That was when a familiar diesel sound rolled in from the road. A red company pickup eased through the gate and came to a stop beside the dead baler. Sam Duffy stepped down from the cab and slammed the door hard enough to turn heads. He adjusted his sunglasses, scanned the yard, and let his eyes land on the yellow baler like a man recognizing a story he'd seen before. Sam was the regional service manager out of Lincoln, the guy the factory sent when they wanted a final word on a problem and maybe a chance to put a new machine in the field. He'd driven more than 100 miles of county roads to get here, and somewhere along the way he'd already decided how this story ought to end. "You're babysitting a museum piece out here, Frank," Sam said as he walked up, slapping the side of the baler with an open palm. "I've seen these a dozen times. Early 70s balers like this? You don't fix them anymore. You replace them." He lit a cigarette, leaned his hip against the frame, and looked at the machine the way a man looks at something he's already written off. "Your customer's going to have to take a new baler," Sam said, voice flat, matter of fact. "That's just reality." Frank didn't answer right away. He watched the smoke drift off Sam's cigarette and disappear over the quiet baler. He thought about Tom, about Tom's wife, about the kids, and about the phone call he'd have to make if he agreed this was reality. Sam pulled his order pad from his shirt pocket. "I can have you a brand new baler sitting here by Friday," he said. "Customer takes the new machine, we roll this one into a trade or a parts unit. Everybody moves forward." He looked Frank straight in the eye. "That's the professional recommendation." At the far end of the yard, a light blue 1971 Ford F250 eased through the gate and rumbled to a stop by the fence. The engine idled for a moment, then clicked off. The driver's door opened, and Walter Briggs stepped down, closing it gently, like a man who hates to slam anything. Nobody in that yard knew it yet, but from the moment that old farmer in the faded feed store cap set his boots on the gravel, the ending of this story, and of the Radley family's year, had already started to change. To understand what happened next, you have to know who the old man in the blue Ford was. Walter Briggs was 75 years old. He'd been working the same 240 acres east of Clay County since 1937, ever since his father handed him a pair of gloves and told him he was old enough to pull his weight. He'd watched neighbors retire, sell out, or borrow big to chase more acres and bigger tractors. Walter just kept doing what he'd always done: plant in spring, cut and bale in summer, put everything away clean and dry in the fall, and spend the winter in the barn making sure every machine he owned would start when he asked it to. His light blue 71 Ford pickup had more than 200,000 miles on it. His barn was the most organized building in the county: wrenches on labeled nails, parts in labeled coffee cans, and a spiral notebook on the bench with entries going back to 1960. In the back corner, under a canvas tarp he re-oiled every couple of years, sat a 1952 International Square baler his father had bought cash. "If we treat this right," his father had said on the drive home, "it'll work longer than we need it to." At the co-op in town, younger farmers with cab tractors and easy payments called his place Briggs Museum. One had even joked he'd buy the old baler for $1 and donate it to the Historical Society. Walter had finished his coffee and gone home without answering. What they didn't know was that Walter had spent 40 years learning the internal logic of harvest equipment. Not just from manuals and meetings, though he used both. He learned from listening to machines run, from feeling vibration through his hands, from watching what happened to the whole system when one small part stopped doing exactly what it was meant to do. For 3 days, he'd driven past Frank Miller's dealership on his way to town, and each time he'd slowed the Ford almost to a crawl to look at the dead yellow baler sitting in the middle of the yard. He hadn't said a word to anyone. This morning, he didn't just drive past. He turned in, parked by the fence, shut off the engine, and climbed down. Canvas work pants, faded blue shirt, old feed store cap. No toolbox, no meter. Just his hands and the notebook in his shirt pocket. Sam Duffy saw him and said nothing. Mike Olson saw him and gave a small nod. Frank saw him and felt something that wasn't quite hope, but close enough that he didn't look away. Walter walked once around the New Holland, slow and careful, not touching anything. He stopped by the hydraulic side and just looked for a moment, head tilted as if he were listening. Then he turned to Mike. "You mind if I take a look at her?" Mike glanced at Frank. Frank nodded. "Go ahead, Walter," Mike said. Sam looked up from his order pad. He took in the old man, worn clothes, empty hands, no logo, no badge, and made his judgment in about 2 seconds. "No offense to your friend here, Frank," he said, loud enough for everyone, "but we've already had a factory tech on this machine. If he couldn't find it, I'm not sure what the old-timer's going to add." Walter was already opening the access panel. He gave no sign he'd heard a thing. "Sir," Sam said louder, with the easy confidence of a man who thinks he knows the ending, "I appreciate the offer, but this is a hydraulic and safety interlock problem on a machine past its best years. This isn't where a second set of eyes helps. This is where you need parts you're not going to find in the field. What you're looking at is a baler that's finished." Walter looked up from the tangle of hoses and valves. He studied Sam for a moment. Nothing hostile, nothing especially warm, just one man looking at another. "What did the relief pressure read when you tested it?" he asked. Sam blinked. "The factory guy checked that," he said. "It was within spec." "Within spec for the book?" Walter asked. "Or within spec for this machine when it actually does its job?" Sam opened his mouth, then closed it again. One of the younger mechanics stopped staring at his boots. Walter turned back to the baler. "These early 70s balers run a narrower effective pressure band than the original manuals show," he said. "The factory updated the internal spec later, but the books that ship with them still have the old numbers. Something sitting at the low end of the printed range looks fine on paper. Out here, it just won't work." He rested his hand on the valve block like a man putting his palm on the shoulder of an old friend. "And there's a little bypass in that safety circuit most people don't know about," he added. "It's barely marked on the customer diagrams. It's spelled out in a field bulletin the company sent to their own techs back in '81. If that passage gets partly varnished over, your gauges will say everything's fine, and the bale will never leave the chamber." The yard went quiet. Even Sam stopped writing. "You're telling me there's a hydraulic path that's not really in the service manual?" he said. "Not in the one that came with the machine," Walter replied. "It's in a bulletin. I've got a copy in my barn." Mike was standing now. Walter looked at Frank. "I'm not going to charge you for this," he said. "If I'm wrong, you've lost 40 minutes. If I'm right, your man gets his hay baled before the rain hits. All I'd ask is a small donation to the County Historical Society when it's done. They helped me with that old 52. $20 would cover it." Frank looked at Sam. Sam lifted his hands a little, as if to say, "It's your yard." "Go ahead, Walter," Frank said. Sam walked toward the fence line and lit another cigarette. He wasn't smiling anymore. Walter Briggs set his notebook on the frame, rolled up his sleeves, and went to work on the baler with the slow, exact movements of a man who'd spent a lifetime listening to machines tell the truth about themselves. Walter didn't rush. He never rushed. He started at the valve block, borrowing a pressure gauge from Mike's toolbox. He spun the fitting on, brought the system up just enough to read it and watch the needle settle. He nodded once, more to himself than to anyone else, then wrote the number down in the small spiral notebook from his shirt pocket. After that, he did something that looked, to everyone watching, almost pointless. He followed the hydraulic lines with his fingers. Not his eyes, his hands. He ran his thumb and knuckles along each hose and fitting, feeling for heat, for stiffness, for anything that didn't quite belong. He did this in silence for long minutes, the way a doctor might listen to a chest before ever reaching for a test. The young mechanics on the buckets glanced at each other. To them, it looked like an old man stalling for time. To Mike, it didn't look like that at all. He'd seen enough men wave tools around to pretend they were working. Walter wasn't pretending. Walter stopped at a section of line near the safety valve assembly, a place no one had paid much attention to. The hose looked fine. The fitting looked fine. He pressed his thumb against the metal, then pressed again, just a little harder. He straightened up. "Mike, you got a half-inch line wrench handy?" Mike already had one halfway out of the drawer. He walked it over and put it in Walter's hand. Walter cracked the fitting loose and eased the line back. There was no dramatic gush of oil, no broken part falling to the ground. What he was looking for you couldn't see unless you knew it existed. Inside the port, where a small bypass passage tied the safety circuit together, a thin amber film clung to the edge of the opening. Not a solid plug, just varnish from old hydraulic oil, baked in layer by layer over years of heat and pressure. On a bench, under bright light, it would have looked like nothing. In this system, on this machine, on this week, it was everything. Walter pulled a short length of baling wire from the same pocket as his notebook. He worked it gently through the tiny passage, clearing the film away, then blew through the fitting to make sure the path was open. He reassembled the line, snugged the fitting down with the wrench, and wiped the excess oil with a rag Mike handed him without being asked. He checked the relief pressure one more time, made another quick note in his book, and then stepped back from the baler. "Let her sit a couple of minutes," he said, "then try her." Mike climbed up into the operator's seat. He wasn't a man given to superstition, but he still looked at his watch and waited, counting out 2 full minutes because Walter had asked for 2. The yard was very quiet. Sam smoked by the fence, eyes on the gravel. Frank stood with his arms folded, not trusting himself to say anything at all. Younger mechanics had stopped shifting on their buckets. 2 minutes. Mike turned the key. The New Holland baler didn't cough, struggle, or complain. It fired. The engine came up to a steady, even idle, like it had never been dead at all. For about 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then one of the young mechanics let out a word that might have been "there" or might have been something else. Later, nobody could say for sure. Mike sat in the seat, hands still on the controls, and watched the gauges come alive. Oil pressure came up. Hydraulic pressure held steady. Everything that was supposed to move, moved. He eased the lever forward. The plunger cycled. The conveyor chain pulled through, clean and smooth. If there had been hay in the pickup, a bale would have slid out the back like it was 1975 again. Walter was already coiling the loose hose and putting Mike's wrench back in the right drawer. He moved with the same unhurried care he'd had before the engine started, like all of this was just a normal chore on a normal Monday morning. Frank walked over and stood next to the running baler, hand resting on the yellow sheet metal as if to make sure it was real. For the first time in a week, he let himself breathe all the way out. The 2 younger mechanics were on their feet now, eyes fixed on Walter. Neither of them said anything. Sam pushed off from the fence and started across the yard. He didn't move as fast as he had when he arrived. He stopped about 10 feet from Walter, who was closing his notebook and slipping the pencil back into his pocket. "I said that machine was finished," Sam said. "I said you weren't going to find the problem in the field." He swallowed once. "I was wrong." He glanced at the two younger mechanics, then back at Walter. "I was completely wrong," he added, louder this time. "And I said it in front of your men, so I'm saying this in front of them too." Walter looked at him without any trace of triumph. "You tested what the manual told you to test," he said. "That's reasonable. The manual just doesn't have everything." Sam frowned slightly, not in anger now, but in concentration. "How did you know about that bypass and the spec change?" he asked. He wasn't defending himself anymore. He honestly wanted to know. Walter shrugged a little. "Had an older baler with a similar system," he said. "Different machine, same engineering idea. Once you understand why something was designed the way it was, you start to see where the problems will show up that the standard tests won't catch." He closed his notebook with a small final tap. "New equipment gets designed by committees," he said. "Old equipment was designed by engineers trying to solve specific problems with what they had. Sometimes what they came up with was smarter than what came after." Sam looked down at the gravel, then back up, held out his hand. "That's the most useful thing I've heard in a long time," he said. Walter took his hand and they shook, plain, firm, unhurried. Two men who now understood something about each other that hadn't existed half an hour before. The New Holland baler was back at the Radley farm before lunch. By early afternoon, Tom had it hooked to his tractor, fuel topped off, twine boxes checked, knotters greased. He climbed into the seat himself. He trusted his own hands more than anyone else's when it came to first passes. He eased the rig into the first windrow. Engine steady, plunger cycling, pickup teeth lifting hay from the ground in a clean, steady stream. Tom watched the chamber pack, listened for any hiccup, and then, 10 seconds later, saw the first tight, square bale slide out onto the rack. He didn't cheer, he didn't whoop, he just exhaled, a long, quiet breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for 3 days. By Tuesday night, most of the big field was done. By Wednesday afternoon, the last full load of dry hay was under cover in the pole barn. When the first sheets of rain came across the pasture on Thursday, Tom stood in the doorway of that barn, hands in his pockets, and listened to it drum on the roof without feeling sick to his stomach. He didn't get every acre before the storm, but he got enough to feed his cattle, enough to keep the bank calm, enough that when he sat at the kitchen table doing the numbers, the pencil never once hovered over the word sell. Back in town, Frank Miller wrote a check for $50 to the Clay County Historical Society, more than Walter had asked for. He dropped it off on his way home, told the woman at the desk it was for a baler problem that didn't turn into a baler sale, and she smiled and wrote it in the ledger. By Friday morning, the story had already started doing what stories in small towns always do. It moved through the co-op, the diner, the feed store, the grain elevator. The details shifted a little with each telling. Sometimes it was 2 mechanics before Walter, sometimes 4. Sometimes the machine had been dead a week instead of 3 days, but the heart of it stayed the same. 3 days, 1 dead baler, a factory tech, a regional manager, and an old farmer who fixed it in less than an hour with a gauge, a piece of wire, and what he knew. In Lincoln, a few days later, Sam Duffy sat in his office with a stack of service binders open on his desk. He had driven back Thursday afternoon, the dead baler now very much alive in his rearview mirror and in his thoughts. Over the next month, on his own time, he drove to the State Extension Library and pulled every field bulletin he could find for the balers and combines his crews worked on. Late one evening, sitting under fluorescent lights that hummed like tired transformers, he read a line in a bulletin from 1981 that described the very bypass Walter had mentioned. There were others like it, 7 bulletins in all that covered system behaviors and failure modes that never made it into the customer manuals or the standard training. Sam started slipping copies of those pages into his technician's training binders. At the next meeting, he didn't make a big speech. He just told his crew there was information in the old engineering notes that the newer books had left out, and that it was worth knowing. He never described it as something he'd learned from an old farmer in a dealership yard, though that was exactly what it was. Some lessons, he decided, you carry quietly. He also started asking a new question on certain service calls, especially when he was sent out to look at older equipment. Is there anyone local who's been working on this machine a long time? The first few times he said it, his younger techs looked at him sideways, half amused. He asked anyway. Twice in the year that followed, the person they found because of that question changed the outcome from replace it to send it back to work. Out on his own place, Walter Briggs went back to his normal rhythm. On the first Tuesday of the next month, he started the old 52 International Baler in his barn, let it run for a few minutes, check the oil, listen to the engine, and shut it down. He hung the wrenches back on their labeled nails, wiped his hands on the same rag he'd been using all week, and made a small note in his spiral notebook. He didn't bring up the New Holland at the co-op. When the story surfaced there, because of course it did, he drank his coffee and let other men tell it how they liked. One younger farmer finally turned to him and asked, "How'd you even know where to look?" Walter thought about it for a moment. "Paid attention," he said, and then he went back to his coffee, which was exactly the way he wanted it. The Baler story could have ended there. One machine fixed, one harvest saved, one quiet thank you that never made the paper. But that isn't how these things really work in farm country. What Walter carried in his head didn't stop at the edge of Frank Miller's yard. It went home with him, settled back into his barn, and waited for the next pair of hands willing to learn it. Walter never called it teaching. He just went on farming. In the winters that followed, his son Mark spent more and more time beside him in the barn. Mark had left for a factory job in Omaha in the late 70s, then come back when the plant cut shifts and the paychecks started shrinking. He was 38 when he moved back into the farmhouse he'd grown up in, broad-shouldered, good with tools, quietly relieved to be working on engines instead of clocking a punch card. At first, he just helped out, holding a light, handing a wrench, fetching parts from town. But as winters turned into springs, he started listening the way his father did. He watched Walter stand by a machine that wasn't running quite right and wait a few seconds before ever lifting a tool. He noticed how his father listened to an engine, how he would sometimes shut it off and say, "That's not a fuel problem, that's a linkage problem," long before anyone else could tell the difference. One evening, after they'd finished tightening chains on the old 52 Baler, Mark sat at the bench and opened a brand new spiral notebook. He wrote the date at the top of the first page and started his own list. What they'd adjusted, why they'd done it, what Walter had said to watch for next season. Walter saw the notebook, said nothing, and set a pencil down beside it. By the late 80s, Mark was running most of the day-to-day work on the place. Walter went from full partner to something like senior advisor, still there, still working, but content to let someone else sit in the driver's seat. The old baler stayed in the barn, started once a month, oiled and checked like everything else. In the summer of 1991, the grain elevator on the north side of the county had trouble. A loading auger jammed hard enough to threaten the main drive shaft. If that shaft twisted or snapped, the elevator would be down for weeks at the tail end of harvest. They brought in a crew with hydraulic jacks and big iron. The tools were strong enough, but they were either too strong or not strong enough. No middle ground, no fine control. Someone mentioned the Briggs place. By then, stories about Walter and that Baler deal had made enough laps around coffee pots that Mark's phone rang. He drove up, looked at the jam, and then drove home again. In the barn, he pulled pieces of steel, chain, and old jack parts from their hooks and built a leverage rig on the floor. A patient, mechanical answer to a problem his father had never seen, built out of principles his father had taught him. 2.5 hours after he came back to the elevator, the auger eased free without a snap or a twist. The main shaft was untouched. By the next morning, trucks were dumping grain like nothing had happened. The crew boss, a man from out of town, asked him how he knew it would work. Mark thought for a moment. "My dad taught me that if you understand why something is built the way it is," he said, "you can usually figure out what it needs. That's most of the job." The man wrote that down on a scrap of paper and kept it in his truck visor for years. Time kept moving. Walter's steps got slower, but the habits didn't change. Every first Tuesday of the month, someone walked into that barn, pulled the tarp off the 52 International, and woke it up. Eventually, it wasn't Walter's hands on the crank, it was his granddaughter's. Her name was Emily Briggs. She was 26 when she came back to the farm full-time, after deciding the town job she'd tried on didn't fit the way she thought it would. She liked the feel of wrenches, the smell of hay, and the quiet satisfaction of a machine running right because she'd made it so. On the first Tuesday after she moved back, she walked into the barn, pulled the tarp off the old baler, and looked at it the way you look at a story you've heard your whole life, but are only now old enough to tell yourself. Mark showed her the notebooks, his and the stack of older ones Walter had filled. Edges curled, pages smudged, but the handwriting steady and careful year after year. Emily bought her own spiral notebook that weekend. On the front page, she wrote, "International 52 Baler, start on first Tuesday." Then she started adding her own notes. In August, they hauled the old baler to the county fair like they'd done for decades. The working antique equipment display sat on the far end of the grounds, away from the rides and the lights. People still came. Not crowds, not cameras, just folks who'd grown up around machines like that, and kids who'd never seen one run. Emily stood next to the baler and answered questions the way her grandfather once had, in plain language, with more patience than she realized she'd inherited. A boy of about 12 stared at the machine for a long time, then asked how old it was. 40 years, she told him. It still works, he said. Starts on the third pull, she answered, and the boy looked at the machine with the kind of surprise people only feel when something old does its job better than they expect. Back home, the chains went back on their hooks, the tarp went back over the baler, and the notebook went back on the shelf. County, on some Tuesday morning that hasn't arrived yet, another machine will refuse to do what it's supposed to do. Someone will call the dealer. Someone will call the factory. Someone will say the machine is finished. And then, maybe, someone will ask a quieter question. Is there anybody around here who's been working on these a long time? When they do, there's a good chance the phone will ring in a house where the lights in the barn come on early, where wrenches hang on labeled nails, and where a notebook on a scarred wooden bench holds 50 years of scribbled lines that all mean the same thing. Pay attention. Treat the work with respect. Carry the knowledge forward. Some knowledge doesn't age. It just waits for the next person wise enough to keep it alive.